Good morning. We're going to begin talking about the labor movement, specifically by going over last night's reading and the reading tonight. So we're going to begin with the section called Industrial Work and the Laboring Class. And we're going to talk about these first 2 points. So let's read this slide. Most working Americans labored long hours. We know about that. And this is the more important note here that I'd like you to think about. As industrialization transformed the nature of work and the composition of the workforce, traditional opportunities for mobility and even for a secure livelihood slipped from the grasp of many working class Americans. So I'd like you to think about that statement and ask yourself, to what degree does social or economic mobility actually exist in American history? We do know, for instance, that there is a certain amount of anti-feudalism that comes out of the early colonial settlements, and that is the prospect that individual Americans can determine their own destiny and can, by their labor, improve their social, political, and economic conditions. But to what degree does that mobility exist? So compare this period in American history with that of the colonial period, the early Republican period, when the country first was founded under the Constitution. Compare it to the Civil War era and the Industrial era. And remember, we're trying to ask here, to what degree does social and economic mobility exist? And I'd like you to consider that for today as well. And does social or economic mobility, is it determined by the nature of work or the composition of the workforce, which is the quote above, or are there other factors? So as this PowerPoint lecture continues, I'd like you to pause and consider some of the questions that I raise. Okay. After you've paused, we're going to move on to the question here of ethnic diversity. So I'll let you take a look at the slide. You can pause, somebody can read the slide to the class, and then I'd like you to consider some of these questions. So your book goes on to point out that occupation was related to ethnic background and experience. Well, what is the exact relationship between ethnic background and skills or experience? Let's consider, is it education that determines the differences between ethnic background and experience? Is it discrimination within society? And if so, I'd like you to consider, how does a segregated nation provide equal economic opportunity for its workers? Or is it the case that segregation determines divisions between occupations and the amount of money that they're able to earn? So why don't you pause and have a discussion on that also. Okay, moving on to some of the other notes of the chapter. Your book here points out that there is a difference in the average number of workers that are working in different establishments between 1860 and 1900. But besides asking you to read this chart, what accounts for these increases? Is it simply immigration or technological innovations? Is it the result of a changing demographic or the skills that certain workers have? Is it foreign competition and trade, or just simply the forces of supply and demand in this country? And think also, when you take a look at this chart, about what is not mentioned, and that is, who is getting hired in these establishments that account for the numbers of workers? How long are they employed? What wages are they paid? And what working conditions do they live in? And I'd like you to consider those factors as well. Okay, your book goes on to talk about some of the changing factors of work itself. Your book points out that the rise of big business, which was largely the result of mechanization and mass production, changed the size and the shape of the workforce and the nature of the work itself. Well, that seems kind of obvious, okay? But your book goes on to say that more and more Americans became wage earners um, during this period. And what qualifies somebody as a wage earner? I'd like you to consider that particular phrase itself. Um, are we specifically talking about people who actually, with their labor, with the amount of time they spend at their job and particular jobs, that the sole point of their job is only to work and earn wages? If that's the case, what does that mean for the the level of social mobility and economic and political mobility that your textbook introduced in the beginning of this section? And I'd also like to ask you a question to consider, and that is, what limits does being a wage earner set on a person's standard of living or on their potential? Um, I'd like you to consider not only the class divisions that were based on the amount of money that people earned, but the divisions that were created by, as your book points out, the size and shape of the workforce and the nature of the work itself. Okay, so let's take a look at some other factors here. Oops. Um, and that is the actual work settings and the experiences themselves. Okay, as with other slides, please feel free to have somebody read this slide to the rest of the class. Um, Once you've done so, I'd like to ask you to consider the point that your book introduces, and that is here, considering the clustering of ethnic groups in certain types of work, and how that also undermined worker class solidarity. Now, one could probably assume that some of this is intentional because of discrimination and segregation that does exist in American society. It is true that um, that would be also the case in the workforce. But why specifically did the clustering of ethnic groups undermine solidarity? And I'd like you to consider this. In a country in which we've determined from previous discussions this week, where public education and the work setting provided both opportunities for um, different ethnic groups to share a diverse culture and diverse opportunities. Why then, if there is growing diversity of opportunities within uh, these two settings, public education and the workplace, why would that undermine solidarity? If there's a sharing of diversity within these two different settings, wouldn't you assume that it would increase solidarity as diversity increased as well? Or were there other factors? What are the implications of the fact that the statement may be true, and that is that ethnic groups and the clustering of them did undermine solidarity? I mean, what would that impact have on the workplace itself, on society as a whole, or as we'll see later, as unions try and struggle to be effective and recognized? And the last statement, the last bullet on this slide is something I'd like to bring up as well. And that is a section of your book that talks about how new arrangements helped humanize the workplace. It almost seems as though, and pardon the bias here, but I'll introduce this for your consideration. It seems as though your book is trying to compensate for the degradations that workers apparently did suffer in work settings by claiming that employers were trying to humanize, or that they did humanize, the workplace. This seems to me to be a similar argument that's made um, by slave owners to justify the existence of slavery by pointing out the humane conditions, or some of the humane conditions under which slavery took place. Please open that up for don't open that up for discrimination. Please open this up for discussion. And as we move to another slide, please feel free to um, pause the screencast here and share that. Okay, we're going to take a look at a couple important factors, and that is that um, your book points out in this section called The Worker's Share of Industrial Progress that there is a massive disruption of class level here in American society, and that is in 1890 that the top 1% controlled more than a quarter of the wealth. And if you expand that top 1% to include the top 10%, that they were able to control a 73% share of the wealth of the nation, even though that workers made up over half of the workforce, and that workers' wages did increase during this period, and, you know, to a certain degree, increase significantly. Okay, these figures are comparable to income distribution in the world today, actually. We have a population of about about 7 billion people in the world, and there are about 2.5 billion people of that 7 billion, a little over a third, that are actually living on less than $2 a day. So it's true that while this share of income distribution existed in the 1890s in America, that this share of income distribution exists in the world as well today. For instance, if the world's population were divided into fifths, each being 20%, 80% of the population would control only 17% of the world's wealth, while that 17% would account for under 20% of the world's population. And then if you divide that 20% of the world's population and the 17% of the wealth that they contained, then you would see that as you rose to the top 1%, the share is much greater. This is part of some of the opposition to the financial and banking sector that the Occupy movement is trying to illustrate. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get closer to the 20th century. So what are the implications for this vast disparity in income distribution? I'd like you to consider that in a democratic government, where, as we'll see later with unions, it's important to consider not just the participation of democracy, but the idea of representation as well. One easy implication that, you know, it could be suggested here is that those who have more wealth have more political influence. And I'd like you to consider, before we move off of this slide, the question of, does the rise in real wages offset income inequality? It's true that there are no real wage increases for average workers today, although income disparity, income division, as far as the distribution of wealth, has risen enormously, even though average pay has not. And we'll actually consider some of the rest of the questions in the slides that we'll take on in the next PowerPoint lecture. Okay, I hope you have an interesting discussion, and on to the next PowerPoint.